Well, hey guys, David here. And I wanted to make this video this morning because I keep hearing a lot of people talking about, if black people just pulled over, if they quit fighting with cops, if they just did what the cops said, then they wouldn't get killed. So I wanted to make this video, and I'm calling it My White Privilege. And I hope anyone out there who sees this video, I wish you would put in your comments if you feel like you've had white privilege. And I think this is why cops or black people are afraid to pull over for cops and why they run on a lot of cases, because the cops treat them differently than we are treated. You just have to admit it. So I'm going to tell a few stories, and this is my white privilege. So the first story I'm going to tell is, let me preface this by saying, when I was young, I'm 46 now, so a lot of these stories happened a long time ago, over almost 30 years, 20-some years ago. But when I was young, I liked to do three things. I liked to drive really fast, I liked to smoke pot, and I liked to drink. So there was this one occasion where I was driving down the highway, and I was speeding, of course, and this cop pulled me over, and he walked up to my truck, and he was like, license and registration or insurance, and I'm like, yeah, and I handed it to him, and he's like, you know why I pulled you over? And I was like, probably because I was speeding. And he was like, yeah, you were doing like 72 and a 55. And then he asked me, do you have any weapons in the car? And I was like, yes. And he was like, what do you have in the car? And I said, I have a 45 caliber pistol. He's like, why do you have a 45 caliber pistol? And I was like, well, I was down at the gun range. I said, I have my little earmuffs with me as well. And he's like, which gun range? And I said, the one back there on 28th Street. And he's like, oh, the indoor one? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, okay. And turned, whipped out to his car, come back, gave me the ticket. I signed it. That was it. So because I was a white guy, he didn't get me out of the car. He didn't even ask to see the gun. He left me in the car with the gun, went back to his car. No big deal. Okay, on another occasion, me and my friend, we were roommates. We were over at another friend's apartment, drinking and shooting pool. And that night, I didn't drink. So it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and we were leaving to go back to our apartment. And my friend Chuck, he was really drunk. So as we're driving home, boom, I get pulled over. So the cop comes up and, asks me for my license and insurance, and I give them to him. And then he asked my friend for his name. And my friend's name was Chuck, but my friend said his name was Derek Ambries. I don't know why he used that name. That's just what he said. So the cop goes back, and he's running our IDs, or running my friend's name and my ID, and he's back there for a long time. So as we're sitting there, my friend starts getting sick, and he opens up the door and starts puking. So the cop, when he sees the door open up, he runs up there and he's like, what are you doing? And I'm like, man, my friend's getting sick and he's throwing up. And so he, gets over there and he looks at my friend and he tells my friend to get out and sit on the curb, and he tells me to get out of the car. So I get out of the car, and he's like, what were y'all doing? And I was like, well, we were at my friend's, we were playing pool, and they were drinking, and he just got too drunk, so I was taking him home. We're roommates. And he's like, were you drinking? I was like, no. And he's like, well, your name came back. He's like, but your friend's name, he goes, the reason I was back there so long is I can't find this Derek Ambries. And I'm like, his name isn't Derek Ambries. And he's like, what's his name? And so I tell him his name, and he's like, well, why did he lie to me? And I'm like, man, I don't know. He's freaking drunk. So he's like, what's his name? So I tell him. He goes back to the car, comes back, and says, okay. He goes, get your friend in the car and take him home. And I was like, okay. So I put him in the car and drove him home. Nothing happened. No ticket, no nothing, false identification, nothing. Another time, I was driving. It was probably 3 o'clock in the morning, and I was hauling butt, man. I was doing well over 120 miles an hour. And so my radar went off, and when my radar went off, I immediately started slowing down. Well, even though, because I was going so fast, when the cop clocked me and pulled me over, I was doing 91 when he got me. So he comes up to the car and he's like, you were driving, 91 miles an hour and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, why are you going so fast? And I was like, well, man, I've been driving for like 3 hours and I'm just so tired and I'm falling asleep. And I said, I just want to get home before I fall asleep. And he's like, well, where are you coming from? So I knew this town that was a couple hours away, and I told him I was coming from that town, and then I lived over in this other town called Euless. And he was like, well, what were you doing in that other town? And I was like, man, I was visiting my girlfriend, and I said, I stayed over there too long, and I said, I'm just trying to get home, and I said, I was falling asleep, and I said, I was afraid that I was going to, have an accident. And he's like, well, you shouldn't be driving so fast. I was like, I know, I'm sorry. And he's like, well, just go ahead and get on home. And I was like, all right, thank you. And went on home. And I'll tell you another time. This is a really crazy one here, and you won't believe this, but this actually happened. It was a Friday night. I was all dressed up. I was going to my girlfriend's, and we were going to a party. And I had weed on me. So I'm driving over to her place, and I get pulled over. So the cop comes up to me, and he's like, I pulled you over for speeding, blah, blah, blah. Let me see your insurance and your ID. So I give it to him. He goes back. He comes back, and he's like, hey, you got a warrant for speeding. And I was like, yeah. And he's like, well, I got to take you in for the warrant. And I was like, okay. So he gets me out of the car, and he handcuffs me in the front. And then he asked me, do you have anything on you? And I said, yeah. He's like, what do you have on you? And I was like, I have like a quarter ounce of weed in my pocket. And he's like, you do? And so he pulled it out, and he looked at it, and he's like, why do you have this? And he's like, you're all dressed up, what are you doing? And I was like, well, I was going to my girlfriend's house, and then we were going to go to this party. And he's like, okay. And I was like, what are you going to do in my car? And he's like, hang on a minute. And so he unhandcuffs me, and he says, just go park it over there in that parking lot at that store. So I was like, okay. So I drive over there and park, and he follows me in his car, and I park it, and then I get out, and then he comes, I go back to him, and he handcuffs me again, and he's like, okay. So he comes and takes me, and he puts me in the front seat of the car, and he seat buckles me in, and then he gets in, and he does his little stuff on the computer and everything, and then we're driving, and as we're driving, we're talking, and he's asking me, where I work and where I live, and I'm telling him, and he's like, oh, did you play football? And I'm like, yeah, I did. And, blah, blah, blah. We're just talking, and just going back and forth and real friendly. So then I asked him, I said, are you going to charge me with the weed? And he looks at me for a minute, and he's like, nah. He goes, I'll just throw it away. And I was like, thanks. And he's like, yeah. He goes, you seem like a good kid. And he goes, I don't want to see you get in trouble. He goes, but I got to, the warrant I can't do anything about. And I was like, yeah, I know, and all that. So we get to the police station, and he takes me in and like does all the booking stuff. But instead of taking me and putting me in the little holding area, he takes me and puts me in this office. And, he unhandcuffs me and everything. And he's like, you were saying you wanted to call your dad. And I was like, yeah, I'll call my dad, and he'll, take care of this. He's like, okay, go ahead and call him. So I was like, okay, thanks. And we're sitting in the office. He gives me the phone. I call. I'm talking to my dad, and the cop says, hey, can I talk to your dad? And I was like, yeah. So I give him the phone, and he's talking to my dad, and they're like talking for a little while, and then, he's laughing and stuff. And then he hands me back the phone, and I'm like, okay. And, my dad's like, all right, I'll be there in like an hour. So I hang up the phone, and I was like, yeah. He's like, yeah, your dad seems like a really nice guy. And I'm like, yeah, he's coming to get me and stuff. He's like, okay. He's like, well, just stay in here. He's like, I got to go do some stuff. So he takes off, and I'm just sitting there, in this office. And then, about 30, 45 minutes later, he comes back in there. He's like, all right, your dad's here. And I was like, okay. And takes me and releases me into my dad's custody. The end. And this happened multiple times. I've had this happen a lot, And I had another incident where a cop, me and my friend were at a big, it was like a big facility. It was like a big bar and dance club and everything. And so, we're in this place, and it's just me and my friend, he's a white guy too, he's like, I gotta go to the bathroom. So he goes to the bathroom, and he's like gone for like a long time. So I'm like looking around the club, and I can't find him. And then a few minutes later, I hear, David Russ, please report to the kitchen area. And I'm like, oh crap, what's going on? So I go to the kitchen area, and there's 2 cops in there, and my friend's laying on the ground puking. And I'm like, crap. So the cop's like, hey, your friend had too much to drink. And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, how much you had to drink? And I was like, oh, just maybe 1 or 2. And they're like, you need to get your car and get him out of here. And I was like, okay. And I did. So as you can see, there's a difference between the way, as a white man, I was treated versus the way black men are treated. You know, maybe I'm lucky and I got good cops. I don't know. But I can understand now, looking at it, why black guys run, because cops treat them differently. They look at them as a threat. I guess I'm not that threatening, but if I had bad incidents every time that I ran into cops, I might want to run too, or I might want to struggle too. So I think as white people, we need to understand that we do have white privilege. So I welcome anybody in the comments to please post your white privilege stories. This is David, Zoe Zizzles. Make sure you like and subscribe. Bye.